We are here with Jane Sterk, the leader of the Green Party of BC. I wonder if we could speak a little bit about a very important issue that sometimes we misunderstand, and that's money. Money is, how important is money to us. I look at some tribes from the past where they just went out in the ocean and fished and brought and distributed the fish, and there was no money. But then we have our society that everything spins around money, and I wonder if you think that there is an alternative to the monetary system, or we are so far embedded that we're stuck with it and we have to deal with it.
Well, I think that we're stuck with it to a certain extent, but there are alternatives. The Green Party, for instance, believes that we might want to explore local currencies for certain things because we believe in a local economy, and that means that you have to be supporting local business. And a local currency is one way to do that. So the merchants in a particular area would get together and create their own money, which is equivalent to the Canadian dollar, and you as a citizen could purchase those say Fernwood dollars and use them with merchants within Fernwood so that you know that your money is kept local.
So the possibility for an alternative choice of how do you want to make your trade is in the hands of the people. Seth Klein, director of the CCPA and the Vancouver chapter, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Let's talk a little bit, just in broad terms, philosophically about money, and then we go into the British Columbia budget and all that. But money, as we understand, as a medium of exchange of goods and services. How important is it for society? I understand there are some societies, native societies, and before our civilization, where they didn't use money; they just distribute their goods and services according to need. And I wonder how important do you think it is? Are we trapped in a society where we spend around money?
Well, I think it's important. I mean, it's true that there are societies that operate more as a straight barter system or exchange goods and services, but that has its limitations. You can't store money. You can't save it for future use. It's complicated. It has its own complications around how you circulate when one person has something that someone else wants, and you don't want something from that person. You want something from a third person, and so you have money as a vehicle for all of that. I would say where we, the bigger questions are we overly materialistic? I would say that we are, and I think because we've individualized as a society, in capitalist society, how we meet our needs. We become very preoccupied with money and savings, because we say looking after your kid's education, you're going to have to do that yourself. Or looking after yourself in old age or your parents in old age, you're going to be left having to deal with that by yourself. Well, that makes people very insecure and makes them feel like they have to save a lot of money. Whereas if we said with many of those things, look, we're going to do those things together as a society, we could chill out about a lot of those things.
You are Mr. Charles Lammam from the Fraser Institute, and you agreed to speak about finances. And finances are based on money. So I thought we briefly have an understanding of what money is. Do you have a definition of it? What is money?
Well, first off, I think money is something that we use as a medium of exchange.
Yes.
Something that we use as a way to minimize on the transaction costs involved with exchanging goods and services.
So it's kind of an measuring tape of how much is my property and how much is your property to keep track of our ownership.
Yeah, I think that when we're willing to spend an amount of money, it shows how much we value the good or service.
That's right. Now, how important is, in your opinion, money for a society? Like, we live in a society here. We have British Columbia as a society, and we have the dollar as the value exchange. How important it is, how detrimental would it be for a society that didn't have money?
Well, again, I think that the importance of money is that it operates as a medium of exchange. Money in and of itself is not valuable. Dollar bills are just papers. What's important is what the money represents. And oftentimes it's very difficult for two parties to barter. If they can't find something that the other party wants, they use money as a medium of exchange, which facilitates that transaction.
How much money is the government of British Columbia get through taxes and other revenues?
Approximately each year, the government of British Columbia takes in about $40 billion in revenues. What's important, though, is that the government is not like regular businesses or individuals. It doesn't earn money, it reallocates money. So it takes money from other people through taxation. It brings it in so it can finance other services that the government provides.
Right. So you said $40 billion. And how is it made up from? Who pays those $40 billion? How much does it come from citizens, individual citizens, and how much from businesses, and how much from resource revenues? Roughly.
Off the top of my head, if I remember correctly, about $6 billion or so comes through personal income taxes. So these are the taxes that people pay on their paycheck. And altogether, that works out to about $6 billion. It's one of the largest sources of revenue for the government. There are other sources of taxation the government of British Columbia relies on. Corporate income taxes. So this is the taxes that businesses pay on the income that they earn. There's property taxes also that go to the government coffers, and a whole host of other taxes, including sales taxes, like the provincial portion of the HST. That's another large revenue source for the government. It also takes in taxes on carbon. So the carbon tax is about $1 billion revenue source. But beyond taxes, the government also has other sources of revenue, like you mentioned, natural resources. So they take in royalties on certain natural resources that are extracted in the province. One of the more popular ones is natural gas. So the government gets a portion of natural gas extracts. In addition to that, they've got other sources of revenue, which include medical service premiums, MSP, which is known by most British Columbians. A whole host of other fees and licenses that British Columbians pay. And finally, there are two other main sources. One is the province of BC gets money that's transferred from the federal government to the province. And finally, the government has a whole set of crown corporations which generate revenues. And that altogether is it's a bit of a snapshot as to how the government of BC takes in and where the revenues come from.
Great. Now, those $40 billion are distributed to the different ministries. Roughly, what amount of those $40 billion is going into different ministries like healthcare, education? Do you have an idea of it?
Well, I think one way to look at it is to say, of all the money that the government spends, which is, again, roughly $40 billion, it's not as much as it's more than their revenues recently because they're running a deficit. So but it's about $40 billion. About 41% of the money that they spend goes on healthcare. So healthcare is by far the government of BC's largest spending item. And it's the same across most provinces. The second largest area is education. So this is K to 12 education and post-secondary education. About 27% of what the government spends goes there. And then the third largest item is social services. So if you think of things like help for lower income people, welfare payments, that sort of stuff, that makes up about 9% of what the government spends. So those are the three major areas. And then there's other things like policing and the protection of property, but they're a lot smaller proportionally to what the government spends.
And it collects from whom? Individual income tax and how much from corporations?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question because that mix has been changing a lot. So, for example, it's a mix of individuals, and from individuals, it's different kinds of taxes. It's income taxes, it's sales taxes, it's the carbon tax, it's property tax. And then from corporations, there's income taxes and and resource royalties and things like that. The province also gets some money and transfers from the federal government and from some other sources, from gaming revenues and some transfers from crown corporations and that kind of thing.
We get revenue from gambling, almost $1 billion from gambling. We get revenue from the property transfer tax, almost $1 billion again from that. So there's multitudes of places that the government gets revenue.
But to give you an example of the shift, if you compare the year 2000 to the year 2000, to last year, because we've had all of these cuts in income taxes, and those are the one progressive tax that we have, where the tax rises as a share of your income, the province has seen about a 1/3 drop in its reliance on personal income taxes, to the point that it now gets about the same amount of money from sales taxes as it does from personal income taxes. It gets more money from MSP premiums than it gets from corporate income taxes.
And why has that change happened in the past 12 years?
Well, I think a lot of that was a very deliberate a shift in how the province collects its revenues, and a transfer from corporations to households, and from upper income households to middle and modest income households, and from progressive income taxes onto regressive taxes and user fees. And that was very conscious. They touted the fact that they wanted to cut personal income taxes by 25%. And in fact, it's been more than that in the last 12 years. But that money has to come from somewhere. And so it has largely come from all of these other sources. And it's also a big piece of the deficit. The provincial government has run a deficit for the last 6 years. And if it hadn't brought in those tax cuts, there would be no deficit.
Is there any specific way that the Green Party would advocate to increase taxes in one of those sectors or decrease in one of those sectors, whether it's corporate or personal or transaction tax or sales tax, I call transaction tax, resource revenues? Is there any specific aspect that the Green Party would prefer to increase?
What the Green Party would like to do is look at the holistic revenue that we get as a province, all of the tax revenue, all of the resource revenue. And we think that there may be an opportunity to do some tax reform. And we would need to look at all of the sources of taxation and the fairness of all of those sources of taxation. We need to look at what the government spends and the shortfall that we have chronically had for the bulk of 20 years, and make sure that the money that's being taken in taxes is being spent on what the people of British Columbia think it should be spent on. So whether or not we need a tax increase would come out of that review. It may be that if we want to live within our means, which is a Green Party platform, that we have to increase taxes or reduce expenses or some combination of the two. Or we need to look at the overall revenue of the province and say, is that revenue being spent in the way that gets the best advantage for British Columbians.
So it's important for the province of BC, and indeed provinces across the country, and federally, the government of Canada, to ensure that their deficits are not persistent, because over time they can add up.
And how are they going to tackle that deficit? Or they should? How should they?
Well, the current concern for me is that we have been in deficit for a while.
Mm-hmm.
There was a recession in Canada back in 2009. We're almost 4 years out of the recovery, but we're still in deficit. The province of BC, the Liberals have promised that next year will be a balanced budget. Now, they haven't been clear about how they plan to get to a balanced budget, but I think what's most important for the government of BC is to start looking at how they budget. They need to be prudent in what they expect revenues to come in for the next year, but they also have to look closely at spending. If you look at government spending over the last 4 years, it has grown. Revenues have also grown. So I think one area, and history tells us that if governments are going to successfully balance their budgets, they should look more to the spending side and avoid damaging measures like increasing taxes, which is something that this current government has used in the recent past and is proposing to use in the future.
Mm-hmm. So I hear you saying then that the government should look at cutting services rather than increasing taxes.
Well, it's not just about cutting services. This is one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have, that when we talk about looking at spending and examining spending, it doesn't mean that government should slash programs and cut across the board. No, I think what it means is, can we deliver government services like the major ones we mentioned, healthcare, education, social services, all the sorts of things, can they do so in a more efficient manner? The government spends quite a bit of money on those areas, but it's not getting the same level of outcomes as jurisdictions around the world.
The Green Party knows that about $300 million a year is spent in subsidies to the oil and gas industry. These are the wealthiest corporations in the planet.
What do you mean by subsidies? When you say subsidies, is that the government is giving them money, or is that they're not charging enough taxes?
That's a combination of both. They're mostly indirect subsidies, so they get tax advantages for doing business in British Columbia. They also get subsidies in the form of infrastructure that we build to enable that industry to go forward. And the Green Party fundamentally believes that industry should be self-sufficient, that we should not be providing those kinds of subsidies to an industry. And so if we look at that and we look at some of the potential excess that we have in some of our bureaucracy, we may find that we have enough money, we're just not spending it properly.
What do you mean by excess and bureaucracy? Too many employees?
No, not necessarily too many employees, but we think that there's maybe an opportunity to look at the management level in a lot of our bureaucracies.
Too many managers, you mean?
Too many managers. We seem to have had a great number of people hired at the middle management level and the senior executive level in the last 10, 15 years. And we think that where we really want the service is where we're providing service to the people of British Columbia. And so there needs to be some sort of rebalance in where the money is being spent in some of the bureaucracies. And we also think that there may be an opportunity to look at how we can reduce costs in some of those bureaucracies.
How do you think we can reduce cost?
Well, for instance, in healthcare, we think that if you look at the expense of pharmacare, for instance, that is going up at an extraordinary rate. We have some real concerns about whether or not we are overprescribing pharmaceuticals, whether the pharmaceutical industry has too much power in suggesting policy to the government because of the financial relationship between the dollars they donate and the current government. And so we think that there are opportunities to look at all of those big bureaucratic systems and saying, are they delivering the best value for the money? And could there be enough money within that system to do the right thing? And if so, how do we make those shifts?
Another example would be to look to user fees. So when people are interacting with the healthcare system, if they're not paying any amount of money out of pocket. They pay through taxes, of course, but not out of pocket. But the out of pocket expense, we know, serves as an incentive for people to use the healthcare system more efficiently. And these are reforms that have been used in other countries, and they've worked well to contain costs, but also to ensure that people are getting access to the services, the healthcare services they need.
I've heard that as a shift in the cost from tax revenue into individuals' pockets. So is that really more efficient for the individual to pay one way or the other? Because in the end, if you have to pay more for an ambulance or for a private service, you're paying more. You don't pay as a tax, but you pay as user fees. So how has it helped the individual?
Well, the key is incentives, right? So how does it impact people's incentive to use healthcare? So we know that currently there are many cases that have been well documented where people are, for example, using the emergency room in hospitals to access healthcare when they need it, when they don't necessarily need it. Sorry. So if people are not paying out of pocket, so in other words, if they don't have an incentive to think about when they're using healthcare services, they'll just continue to use it because the cost of using it on the margin is zero. But if there is some sort of an incentive, a disincentive to use the system when they don't need it, in fact, that shows that people will use it less, more resources will be used to people who actually need the services, and overall the quality of healthcare won't decline.
So what is there a better way of distributing that money, you think? What is the alternative budget that you prepare every year? How should that money be distributed?
Well, we haven't done an alternative provincial budget in a few years, but we did just publish about a week ago a paper called Progressive Tax Options for BC, because we basically have, the political debate saying the cupboard is bare, we can't afford anything. And, these days the opposition seems to say that as much as the government. And so we published a paper showing that there are all kinds of revenue options for the province. But really, before you even start deciding, well, which taxes would you want to raise, I think we need to ask ourselves as a society, what are the things that we want to pay for together? And then how do we want to raise the money? There's some interesting comparisons in that paper. For example, we looked at a calculation that asked, how much more revenue would we have in BC if instead of, these ads telling us how great it is that we have the lowest taxes in the country, what if we were just average? What if we just collected taxes at the average for Canadian provinces? The answer is the public treasury would have $2.4 billion more to work with, meaning no deficit and a lot more money to get us out of this budget squeeze and fund all kinds of services.
You're talking of income taxes when you say the average taxes of Canadians. Income taxes.
That's looking at income and MSP combined, actually.
And how about corporate and other natural resources revenue?
The corporate taxes in British Columbia are also among the lowest in the country. If you look at both the general rate and the small business rate, we are the lowest in the country. And so there's definitely room to move there. In fact, on the corporate side, KPMG, this global accounting firm, does this study each year where they look at the cost of doing business in major cities in about 14 countries. And last year they did a special comparison just looking at business taxes and found Vancouver was the least expensive place after Chennai, India. The bottom of the list of 55 cities in 14 major countries. So there's lots of room. And then you asked about resource royalties. Huge giveaways there. I mean, whether you look at royalty rates for forestry and stumpage rates, whether you look at water costs, that corporations, are getting water for basically for free. And I think one of the most important ones is natural gas. The finance minister keeps giving us these quarterly updates talking about how revenues have collapsed for natural gas. But the interesting piece is that production is actually at a record level. The problem is that the royalty regime, instead of being based on the volume, is based on the price. And because the North American price has collapsed with all the fracking happening everywhere in the continent, that we're basically giving away a finite greenhouse gas.
You're being very cautious and saying there may be some extortion of prices and all that, but you don't know as a matter of fact that is happening.
We don't know as a matter of fact, and the Green Party is a very cautious party. We're not going to prescribe something until we have the evidence that suggests that a path forward can be found. And we haven't the opportunity to be inside government to be able to really see what's going on. And we often wouldn't have that expertise. We'd want to employ academics and people in industry that could help us make those assessments.
When you are not in government and control, you are basically speculating of what might be happening up there because you don't have the numbers. For example, if I say the gas companies, mining companies, they are not paying enough taxes or enough royalties. You don't have the numbers to say, yeah, that is in fact the case because they're only paying 10%, for instance, instead of 25%. How can we find out more specifics of what's going on within the revenues of the government?
Well, I think that we can find out those specifics. What is the actual revenue that's derived from royalties in mining or royalties in the oil and gas industry? And then we could look at how are royalties derived elsewhere. And I think that we would be safe to say that the royalty rates in British Columbia are quite low compared to comparable rates in other parts of the world, for instance, in Europe or even in Asia. And so there would be, I think, an opportunity for us to say, okay, we don't need to be at the bottom of the barrel. We could be competitive with other jurisdictions. And, of course, the Green Party is concerned about the environmental impact of all of those activities. And we think that what is currently called the externalities, the things that we don't count, like the impact of these activities on health, the impact of these activities on our fresh water supplies, on our local communities.